Okay, so we're gonna continue with what we started last week with reading Ivo De Janeiro's book, The Principles of Philosophy, and we started reading the chapter on Heraclitus and the Logos. I mean, the sense. Tell me if this feels like a good summary to you guys, but my sense is that, if we think about the Logos, right, is the gathering, right, and that everything that we experience it as gathered, right? This phone, all the parts of this phone is gathered into this phone, all the parts of that lamp is gathered into that lamp, and it shows itself in this gathering, and everything's kind of gathered together and belongs together. And that in some sense, kind of, we'll say pre-philosophical thinking, it's kind of like we in some sense just lived in that gathering and dealt with all the things gathered together. However, it was the pre-Socratics, and specifically Heraclitus, that started to actually mind the gathering as such, which is quite a miraculous thing to have to conceive of, because it doesn't really appear as something gathered per se, but it actually withdraws, right, in everything being kind of gathered together in intelligibility. So to kind of mind that principle, right, in some sense is the base. It's kind of like it's the basis of the West, right? If they didn't have those thoughts and start to perceive those things, like everything that we call Western is kind of almost like wouldn't be in some sense. So that's
minding that which minds as well. That minding that which minds the gathering as well.
Yep.
It's minding.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
Daniel, you're muted. Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, of course, when we talk about especially this thing here, this is also gathering, but a very different gathering of, let's say, the gathering of the wine grapes. That what we will read.
What we will read, yeah.
All right, so page 91. You want to start us off, Daniel, and then we'll go Sandra and then me.
Okay.
Sure. So it might be just for the people listening. We were last time you were reading this fragment. Fragment 50 on Logos. And now we have explications of that fragment. So all the parts, all the important components, we go into deeper analysis of that. So first thing is Logos. What does Logos mean? The dictionary lists the following meanings among others: account, reckoning, measure, relation, proportion, analogy, explanation, argument, discourse, rule, principle, law, reason, ground, definition, narrative, story, speech, verbal utterance, talk, phrase, debate, dialogue, deliberation. According to Aristotle's famous dictum, man is the living being that has, i.e., holds himself within Logos, zoon, logon, echon, while animal is the living being without Logos. Logos is derived from the verb legein, which means to tell, to say, to speak, but also to count, to account, but also, and in the first place, to gather. Legein, in turn, is formed from the same root as Latin legere, and German lesen. The meaning of this root being precisely to gather, to pick up, to select. Therefore, in order to approach an understanding of logos, we must first ask, what does to gather mean?
Let us consider as an example the gathering of fruit, for instance, the gathering of grapes in a vineyard. Grape gathering, grape harvesting, does not simply consist in plucking grapes and heaping them up somewhere. In fact, if asked to participate in a harvest, a layman would not know where to start, because for him the vineyard is an indistinct place where grapes that should be plucked are confused with others that shouldn't. The regard of the experienced gatherer, on the other hand, can distinguish at first sight between different grapes, stages of ripening, and so on. However, the light that allows for these distinctions comes from the knowledge of the ultimate destination of these grapes, namely different kinds and qualities of wine, grape juice, etc., which in their turn are meant for specific occasions. Thus, gathering implies, in the first place, establishing a clarity and an order where, to start with, there is confusion and disorder. This allows the selection of what is to be gathered. After having been selected and plucked, the grapes are brought together or collected. This, however, is not the end of the gathering, for now the collected grapes must be recovered and secured in an environment that favors the right fermentation, so that they can eventually turn into the envisaged final product, which in turn is defined by a certain final destination or purpose within the whole of sense relations that form the sphere of human dwelling: libation, celebration, rite, commemoration, etc. Thus, gathering involves the following moments: clearing what is confused and hidden, freeing from confusion. Furthermore, selecting and sorting. Finally, collecting and recovering. These moments form a whole that is guided by, and has its principle in, the anticipating regard over the final recovery. In our example, the recovery of certain grapes needed for that particular quality of wine, in light of the ultimate destination or purpose, which the wine grower is expecting to obtain. It is from there, i.e., from the step that in the factual sequence comes last, that for the expert, everything in the vineyard makes sense in a way it doesn't to the blind regard of the layman.
We can now better understand why the Greek language would resort to a verb that means to gather in order to indicate the meaning, to count, to say, to speak. In fact, to say something, just as with foreign words, means to show it, to let it be seen. Thus, showing consists in clearing and clarifying what, to begin with, does not show. That is, in wresting it from confusion and dissimulation and absconding, and in finally recovering what is thus cleared and brought to light in a word or in a texture of words, whose saying accomplishes and preserves the indicating or letting see. It is not difficult to show that counting and recounting also consists in a gathering. The same is true for reading. That is, the gathering of letters into syllables, of syllables into words, of words into sentences, of sentences into an argument. And all of this, thanks to the fact that the reader has in advance gathered himself into a likely, i.e., expectable, acceptable, accomplished sense that calls for an argument, and hence sentences, words, and syllables to sustain and unfold it.
In Legain, nothing is done to, that is, no action is being performed on what is gathered, namely in its being, and thus shown. Something, a being, is there to begin with, but in a sense, not completely so, as it is in abeyance, still expecting or hoping to be gathered in its being, yet in anticipation of being recovered in its truth. The saying, Legain, then leaves it laying there, but in so doing, finally lets it appear as what it is, thus placing it in the light of its gathered appearance. Thus, Legain is letting something be in the manner of a gathering that lets it lay there, where there means in the openness of its being. A poet, for instance, who writes a poem about the Dolomites mountain range, does not perform any action on those mountains. Nevertheless, the poem lets them be, namely, it lets them arise as such, places them in their unique appearing. For the poet, as for the painter, that mountain range is never contingent stone formation, but precisely a unique appearance, expecting to be saved as such. In fact, once things are free from the constriction of contingency, they are at once in need of, and thus anticipating and hoping for, a saying that preserves them in their flagrant being.
Okay. As we have just seen, in order to clarify the meaning of logos as Heraclitus' name for the one, unitary and unifying principle of everything, we must refer to its fundamental trait, namely gathering. However, this only helps if at the same time we already have a sense or inkling of what a principle is. For the understanding of logos can never be the result of a semantic analysis of the word form logos. Put differently, if we already think, i.e., if we expect to acknowledge what has the traits of a principle, then looking into the meaning of words, i.e., into their etymology, can be of aid to our thinking. In fact, looking into the meaning of words is then a way of setting free the knowledge that is stored within our languages, given that each of them is, in the first place, a unique manner in which the principle says itself. Or with reference to human speech, the speaking through which the principle has its say over beings, by nominating them as such, as holders of the principle's own truth.
The following is our sense of what a principle is: a discontingent source of beings as such and in whole. In what manner is logos such a principle? Answer: as a gathering. And this now means as a bringing together or unify that does not simply bring a mass of scattered things into a somewhat concentrated and ordered totality, but as a discontingent collecting that, while keeping to itself, gathers things into a harmonic whole in such a way that, one, the wholeness of the whole constitutes itself only thanks to this discontingent gathering. And two, things are in the first place laid or placed into the open and there preserved in their wholesome and fair, i.e., discontingent being. The latter is wholesome and fair insofar as it holds in itself the wholesomeness and fairness of the whole, so that things themselves, in their irreplaceable uniqueness, befit the whole, while at the same time fitting together with all other things. Logos is this gathering place into a whole, which is everywhere in and between things, but is itself neither a thing nor an emptiness, but a pure schismatic joining and fitting, thanks to which each being lies there, i.e., in an openness of being, as itself and at the same time as homely to us.
A fundamental trait of logos, which already emerged from our example of grape gathering, is the following. Logos is a lightening of what before was in its being, weighted, burdened, encumbered by confusion and indistinction. In fact, logos, the gathering, is itself the breaking of an openness, clearance, or freeness for the gathered whole of lightened, freed things. Clearly, neither the lightening nor the breaking of an openness are to be intended in a contingent sense. The coming or eruption of logos kindles beings into their fair, measured, wholesome being. It disencumbers them from being burdened by the burden of a confused or inaccessible or forgotten sense. However, it does not affect them in any contingent way.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I was blowing my nose. It's allergy time. Going back to the Heraclitus. But if you listen to the logos, is logos some spiritual, perhaps even mystical entity that sends messages we should be ready to catch? And again, what does to listen mean in this context? To begin with, logos is not conceived as the source of some more or less intelligible truth or even information. Rather, as logos breaks, namely breaks out into a knowledge of itself, this breaking addresses and claims the human being as the unique being whose fundamental trait is shown to consist in being open to and reaching into that knowledge, namely in the way of having to bear and ground it. Therefore, listening to the Logos means, for man, answering that claim. That is, owning to his now flagrant native belongingness to the Logos itself and to its knowledge. Finally, listening to the Logos means letting one's being, which already belongs to it, be claimed and owned by, i.e., of avail to it, and thus, by bearing its knowledge, freely belonging to the Logos itself.
How does man belong to the Logos? Answer: through his own Logos. In fact, we need to distinguish between two logi, logi being the plural form of logos. On the one hand, logos itself, or logos as the unifying one, the principle. On the other hand, man's logos. Of man's logos, fragment 45 says the following: the outermost ways of the soul, or psyche, as you go, you will not find them. Even if you walk down every path, such a fair leading, far showing Logos is the soul have. I'm going to read that again. The outermost ways out of the soul, as you go, you will not find them. Even if you walk down every path, such a fair leading, far showing Logos does it through the soul have. Heraclitus here means psyche, a word that is usually translated as soul. However, if we merely replace psyche with soul, nothing is gained or understood. In fact, who could pretend that we possess a clear and definite notion of what the soul is? And even if we did possess such a notion, who could affirm and take for granted that this notion is identical to the Greek notion of psyche, or even that it comes close to it? If we are honest, we can neither affirm the former nor assert the latter, which is why we must ask, what does psyche mean? A provisional answer, we can say the following: psyche is man's openness toward the principle, and therefore his constitutive capacity for being attained and concerned by the principle itself. The psyche is the being through which man reaches into and is reached by Logos. In fact, the psyche consists in nothing but this: the reaching out into the Logos, which this reaching out brings in, recovers the Logos itself, namely, insofar as the Logos in the first place, through psyche, reaches into us. Thus, psyche is the Greek name for man's being, insofar as this being consists in a knowing reference to the Logos, namely, the outreaching, bringing in of what reaches into our being. However, this outreaching, bringing in, corresponds precisely to the sense of gathering or lijan. Thus, it is not only the Logos that gathers, but the psyche, too, consists in a gathering. And what does the psyche gather? Answer: the Logos itself. It is only thanks to the logos of his psyche, where man in the first place gathers the logos itself, that he can also gather what is, understand, and in multiple manners relate to single beings as they appear as such in and out of the logos. Why? Because if the logos is not gathered in the first place, and thus born in its original gathering, if the logos' gathering is not met by the gathering of man, namely by man's gathering of the same that is gathered by the logos itself, if man's being does not, so to speak, collaborate with the logos' gathering, expectant beings cannot come to light in their fair, wholesome, measured sense, and the measure for man's relation to beings remains wanting. Indeed, grasping something as such means letting the logos of one's psyche collaborate with the logos in order to place that something in the light of its sense.
The reference of Psyche, thanks to its logos, to the logos is not a reference between two things. In other words, there is no way to state where the Psyche's gathering ends and the gathering of the logos begins. There is no fixed border or delimitation between the two, nor merely an absence of borders and delimitations. In fact, the relation between the two consists in an original limit, a gathering apartness, a schism, which, on the side of man, marks his finiteness or mortality. The psyche is akin to the logos, which is not something, but nothing or nothing. Both meet in their constitutive limit while gathering the same. In fact, we can go as far as saying that psyche is the openness of, i.e. belonging to, the logos by which the latter extends itself to man in the form of a stress or and claim for acknowledgement. I'll just repeat that. In fact, we can go as far as saying that psyche is the openness of, i.e. belonging to, the logos by which the latter extends itself to man in the form of a stress and claim for acknowledgement. This is to say, while psyche is man's being, that very being is used by the logos as the abode to which it, i.e. logos itself, comes, and through which, so to speak, it breathes, while man, the mortal being, through his own logos, needs to be, i.e. bear, suffer, give the needed firmness to that abode. We can also say this in the following terms. Psyche is the ground where man and the logos meet, but the latter is the owner of that ground, while man is his own self insofar as, by listening to the logos, he bides as its keeper. The capacity thanks to which man can be the keeper of that ground is man's own logos. That is, his own manner of gathering the same as that which gathers in the first place.
Once we have indicated psyche as the trait of man's constitutive belongingness to the logos, we can see how psyche in fact rests within a limit, which is not a border or a line where it stops, but rather an illocal schism or scissure, whence it begins and is nourished and invigorated, or on the contrary, diminishes and withers. This limit, which cannot be localized, while on the other hand, it assigns each thing to its time and place, is the scissure of the logos, namely the scissure that the logos itself is, which, while gathering onto itself the logos of Psyche, at the same time sins or schisms itself from it, so that man can listen to the logos itself only by applying his own logos to that very gathering, sending fissure as such. Thus, the logical fissure is within Psyche, while Psyche itself consists in this fissure. Thus, the, quote, logical fissure is, quote, within Psyche, while Psyche itself consists in this fissure. Again, the latter bears the fundamental sense in which we can say that man's being is finite, and that man is truly who he is, namely a mortal being, insofar as he bears his openness to the scissure of, i.e., that is, the logos.
In accordance and gathering breaks. This translates the single word homologian. The latter consists of two components: homos, which means the same, and legion. Therefore, it means to gather the same as, to say the same as, literally, with a strange sounding but appropriate word, to same say. In the present context, how do you pronounce that Greek word? Homologian. Homologian.
Homologane.
Homologane. Homologane refers to the same saying that occurs when the psyche's gathering, instead of zeroing in on the one who is speaking, lets itself be gathered onto the limit that is the gathering of the logos, and thus gathers the same as that in which the gathering of the latter consists. Thus, the meaning of homologane can be elucidated as follows. Having tuned oneself to the logos, gathering saying the same as the logos, and thus in accordance or in tune with it, more precisely, being one and the same tune with the logos itself. In short, being a unison.
The accordance of the two logoi does not imply that they merge or melt into each other. Thanks to the attuning call of the logos, man's logos is tuned in with the former, so that in the accordance, both logoi are themselves and, within a unison, are parted from each other. But how could the logos tune man's logos to itself, i.e. to the logos itself, if it was not already, as such, the calling accordance of both logoi? And how could man's logos let itself be tuned into the logos, if man's logos did not already, as such, i.e. natively, belong to the accordance of both logoi? However, this implies that the accordance, the schismatic unison, is the more original phenomenon, that is, more original than the separately considered logoi. And in fact, the accordance is the original core rather than the mere result of a tuning process of two independent logoi. What is most original, and thus the only true principle, is the simple same of the accordance. That accordance, however, is the logos itself as a relation, namely the relation of an attuning call directed to man and man's logos as a belonging, tuned in answer to that call. The tuning in with the logos itself then consists only in this, letting the logos gather as the accordance or unison that it is, and which it never fully is without man's attuned answer. Thus, the breaking of the logos, of its knowledge or openness or truth, is precisely the breaking of the same in which, provided man listens to its gathering, man's logos and the logos are in accordance or concordant with each other and attuned to one another. On the other hand, without man's tuning into it, without man's gathering the knowledge of the gathering itself, the logos cannot hold sway as the gathering that frees or lightens the wholeness of beings. You muted again, Sandra.
The next part from Heraclitus. A fitting knowledge holds. Thanks to the unisonal accordance of man's logos and the one, unifying logos, the latter, that is, this unison itself, can hold sway as the knowledge that it is in a human knowledge. The knowledge that the logos itself is its own invisible openness, its own invisible truth, its own invisible flagrancy. The knowledge that the logos itself is its own invisible openness, its own invisible truth, its own invisible flagrancy. The human knowledge of the logos is the simultaneous acknowledgement of that knowledge, which, i.e., the acknowledgement, bears and grounds it as such. In that born, grounded, preserved knowledge, the coming of the logos has its abode, so that it can fully unfold its gathering. The Greek word that is here translated as fitting knowledge is sophon, the nominalization of the neutral form of the adjective sophos, which the dictionary translates as skilled, clever, prudent, wise, learned, ingenious. The noun, Sophia, knowledge or wisdom, is the second component of philosophia. We translate sophon, the knowledge of the logos born in a human acknowledgement, as fitting knowledge, because this knowledge is fitting in two senses. On one hand, it is fitting as the knowledge that grounds the logos, thus allowing it to openly hold sway. On the other hand, it is fitting as the knowledge in which comes and is allotted the measure thanks to which beings are gathered in their fittingness as such, and simultaneously in their reciprocal fitting. In other words, the sophon is the knowledge in which is kindled and erected the whole of fitting, i.e., harmonic, beings.
Going back to the fragment, quoting the fragment, one atoning all. When the fitting knowledge of the logos obtains in its own openness, it openly holds sway as the gathering same. However, we are now told explicitly what has already been anticipated, namely that the Logos holds sway as one, that is, as a unity. As this unity, it is also unique or only. The Logos is one as the uniquely one, or only one. The one itself, in turn, consists in unifying or atoning, bringing to one, or unifying. What does the only one atone? Answer: all. Or what is that? Or panta, all. The Greek word panta, which is the plural form of pan, all, every, does not just mean the sum or totality of all beings. Rather, it indicates the entirety of beings, insofar as these beings are in abeyance and thus ready, expecting to be collected and absconded into a whole. In other words, panta means what is ever expecting to constitute and show itself as the whole of beings, or beings in whole. The difference between the sum or totality of beings and the whole of beings is that between a contingent matter of fact, which is knowable through some knowledge of contingency, and a dimension of relations of sense that have a discontingent source, which is knowable only through lijan. Panta indicates the discontingent whole of discontingent being as such. This discontingent source, which, while keeping to itself, generates and keeps the whole as such in the Logos as the atoning one, now unisonally born and kept in a discontingent knowledge. The beings that are ready to be atoned in this whole are in their turn released or kindled into their fitting mode and measure. Finally, the fitting measure is the measure thanks to which each single being as such, in its unique manner, gathers and preserves the whole of the whole. Shall we go into, yeah.
Mm. I just read over on page 89 the translation of the fragment again, just to sort of remind myself of what all this has been addressing. So I would think it might be helpful to do that. Would that be okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you do not listen to me, that is to my words, as if they were merely a statement of how things are to me and for me, but rather to what my saying indicates, to wit, the Logos, that is the gathering. If, as a consequence, you yourself mind it and tune into it, and indeed tune in with it, thus owning to your being's native belongingness to it, then an accordance in gathering breaks, a tune in one's voice, namely an accordance in which your own gathering, the gathering in which your being consists, belongs to the same with, and indeed gathers the same as, the original gathering, in such a way that your gathering actually gathers the gathering itself, so as to let all things be gathered accordingly. There, in the flagrancy and openness of that accordance, a fitting knowledge of the original gathering holds. The knowledge in which the gathering itself shows as the one atoning all. That is, as the one that, by virtue of its atoning, kindles beings as such and in whole.
How about we do the the second version, provided you listen not to me, but gather yourself into the gathering itself. In accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Mm-hmm.
Seem like a good one?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So we'll start with chanting. Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. An accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. In accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Okay, last round.
Mm-hmm.
Provided you listen to me. Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
Provided you listen not to me, but gather yourselves into the gathering itself. And accordance in gathering gives rise to the fitting knowledge. One atones all.
All right, short speech. One is already holding sway.
I'm trying to track the source of my breathing.
It feels um, only fitting that I release my attachment to the contingent.
Even my hiding from it is already it holding sway.
The nature of what it means to be a human being has become mysterious to me.
Questioning is freedom.
Attuning into is already attuned.
Gathering myself has the quality of surrendering.
listening truly is always listening through too.
Holding the openness, the atonement appears.
What I reach for is finding I've already been reached by.
The text cautions me to be careful with my thoughts, my sayings.
Finiteness, feels like a blessing.
I want to receive it.
What word is sufficient for beings in their fair, wholesome measure? appearing.
Lord, open my mouth that I may speak your name and be human.
Hearing it is already being heard by it.
Silence is gathering openness.
The whole, the holy, held in the heart.
It is so close, I could barely hear it.
Psyche seems like the gathering of all senses.
If you do not listen to me, if I do not listen to you, but rather listen,
Heraclitus is urging us to have stereoscopic vision.
How can there be a humanity that saves the phenomenon?
always already.
How I hold the world mirrors in how the world holds me. And the fact of that mirroring is already being held. That I perpetually forget. And we can go into we can start responding to each other now. Tuning into the beginning of the, provided you listen not to me, I hear the urge to listen through. And there's something also about my simultaneous ability to not listen through.
Mm.
That in some sense is integral to when I do listen through, makes it a real listening.
I even wonder what listening is. It's not kind of receiving words. Like what do we actually do when we listen? What creates a gathering? Is there something else? What is listening not? What do we think it is? So on.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering what our senses are. Because I think we can also taste the logos. We can. I think the Greeks have this tendency to like seeing, also talk a lot about seeing and listening, but I think all senses can or can potentially be of service in this task that Heraclitus is laying out, this philosophical task.
I hear in that this way that the senses, right? Our sense is in some sense a reaching out that in some way has already been reached.
I would like to have a different word than questioning, but something that captures the open questioning that listening can be, but questioning not in a concrete sense of asking questions, simply opening in listening. And I hear questioning when I listen. I hear questioning always when I listen in that way.
Listening as a gathering yourself into the gathering itself. Listening, in some senses, we say everything that is heard arises from silence. Therefore, the deepest listening to listen through into is always a listening for and to silence. And in some way, listening itself is already a silence. This kind of mutual gathering accordance.
Yeah, I finished reading the introduction to metaphysics today. And for Heidegger, the question about being or about principle is also tied then to the question, what or who is the human being? Those two always go together. And then questions about what is freedom? What is it to be mortal or finite, and so on. Those are always issues that go together with this.
I have to go soon.
Okay.
And we'll give you the last word for today, Sandra.
Mm. I seem to come back over and over to this question mark, this internal symbol of who and what I am. And that holding that feels right.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.